Yes, I want to talk about pair programming, which is a practice that is, I think, quite well known in the industry, but I still see quite patchy adoption out there. And the title of the talk, actually, I was told when I first created this talk, and I did a little dry run with my colleagues, and one of them said, actually, this title might make people think that you want to give them a balanced view of the pros and cons. But actually, I give you full disclosure up front, like, this is supposed to be a pitch. I want to convince you that it's a good idea. And so my Shakespeare isn't particularly strong, my knowledge of Shakespeare, but this is, of course, a play on the famous monologue by Hamlet, who says to be or not to be. And I actually looked this up again on Wikipedia, and there it says about that sentence that Hamlet is bemoaning the pain and unfairness of life, but acknowledging that the alternative might be worse. And I wonder if for some people, or for me, if, like, sometimes pairing is like that. Like, I'm sometimes also bemoaning some of the pain, but the alternative, which is not pairing or never pairing, might actually be worse. And I want to start at the beginning in the 1940s with the very first programmers. So on this picture here, you can see Gene Bartik and Betty Snyder in front of the ENIAC, which is considered to be one of the very first electronic computers. And the ENIAC women are considered to be the very first programmers. And so they didn't have any role models. They had to try and figure out what to do, how to be successful at programming a computer. And here's a quote from Gene Bartik from an interview she gave. She says, "Betty Snyder and I, from the beginning, were a pair. And I believe that the best programs and designs are done by pairs because you can criticize each other and find each other's errors and use the best ideas." And when I saw this interview, it kind of blew my mind a little bit, because I was like, wow, the very first programmers decided that it would be a good idea to pair. But then if we fast forward 30, 40 years later, I saw a tweet by Alan Cooper last year. He is the father of Visual Basic. And so when he first started programming, which must have been around the 70s, if I'm interpreting his Wikipedia page right, he says that that when he started programming, it was a solo skill performed by individuals with little or no sharing and virtually no collaboration. And so it was quite a different world 30, 40 years after Gene Bartik and Betty Snyder. And then yet another 10 to 20 years later, that's when, in the late 90s, the term pair programming first became more widely spread through the Extreme Programming book by Kent Beck. So that's now 50 years after the first programmers. And so at this point, at least some people in the software development world started thinking that we needed to get the pendulum back, or maybe they didn't even realize there was a pendulum, but that we needed to be more collaborative when we were programming. And in the Twitter thread, Alan Cooper also says later in the thread that he doesn't think it matters one whit if you use Scrum or Jira or stand-ups or burn-downs. Only one thing truly makes a difference: do you code in a group? And he's later also saying in the thread that he thinks there's often intense debate in development circles of every single tiny detail of how to do agile, but almost no discussion of coding in pairs or groups. I don't know if that's entirely fair, that there's almost no discussion of that. I certainly see a lot of discussion of that, at least in my bubble where I work right now at ThoughtWorks. So here are a few subject lines from a very vibrant mailing list that we have internally about pairing. So there's lots of discussion there, actually. On the other hand, I have to agree with him that overall it does seem like this is not given as much attention as many of the other practices. A vast majority of the clients that we work for example, ThoughtWorks is a consultancy, they usually don't have pair programming as a common practice when we get there, and also when we try to convince them to do it, there's often a lot more resistance than to other things like, let's say, TDD, for example. And you can also see that by some of the subject lines on our mailing list, like pairing practice being challenged, requests for input and feedback. Also, most of the applicants for a job as a developer with ThoughtWorks Germany that we see have not had much experience with pair programming, which is not a deal breaker, but it also shows something about the adoption. So if we had that as a hard requirement to only hire developers who have strong experience with pair programming, we probably couldn't hire very many developers. So why is that? Why is there so much pushback, or why is it not adopted more? I think there are two main reasons from my perspective. The first one is that it's kind of a long game. So you can see short-term benefits like less errors, and you have to do less rework because you have two people working on the thing together. But ultimately, it's a lot about medium to long-term consistent quality and maintainability, and you might not see that immediately. And as developers, we also like the gratification of making something work today and right now, and that's also something that we share with project managers sometimes, maybe, because for them also pair programming feels counterintuitive. Doesn't it have the productivity of the developers? So Martin Fowler wrote a little piece about that on his website 13 years ago. And his answer to this, that pair programming halves the productivity of developers, is that that would be true if the hardest part of programming was typing. So it's not about the number of lines of code, but it's about effectiveness and productivity. And unfortunately, it's very hard to measure those. The second reason why I think it's not as adopted as it maybe should be is that it's kind of hard. So you don't just go and sit at a desk and there's two programmers and you do the same thing that you did before. There's just challenges that come with it. So what I want to talk about first is how pair programming can increase a team's effectiveness. So why do it? What are the benefits? Then I'll also talk about what's usually hard about it and a few ways of how to tackle some of the challenges. And finally, if I haven't quite convinced you yet, I will finish my pitch with another last effort and talk about, once more, is it really worth the hassle? So I'll start with the positive stuff, the benefits. So I only started pairing regularly about 7 years ago when I joined ThoughtWorks. And before that, when somebody asked me if I had experience with pair programming, I would probably say, yeah, when I get stuck, I call somebody else over and we sit together for a while and we solve the problem. So if that's pairing, then yes, I have done that before. But I hadn't had much more experience with it. And what I knew about it was from the Extreme Programming book. So this is my edition that I have at home, actually. And as you can see, I doodled a little peace sign on it when I read it back in the day, because it was one of my first exposures to agile back then, and it all seemed so peace, love, and understanding compared to what I was seeing in my job during the day, which at the time was quite a more traditional waterfall project. And what I understood at the time and what already resonated with me in theory before I did it more was this idea of pairing being more than the sum of the two pairers. So you put two people together and you get more out of it because you have the knowledge sharing, so you're avoiding silos on the team, you help each other get unstuck, so the proverbial rabbit hole, you try to avoid that together. You can combine, sorry about the clicker. You can combine these two modes of thinking. So you have the person who is typing, who is in a more of a tactical mindset and thinks more about the little details. And then you have the other person sitting next to them, who's kind of like one or two steps removed and can more look at the bigger picture and maybe take some notes for what you're going to do next. And also, it's easier to onboard people when you do pairing. So these are, I think, quite intuitively understood benefits of pairing. But really, pairing pretty consistently over the last 7 years then gave me some additional realizations about its benefits that I hadn't realized before, and how it also ties together with the bigger picture of team effectiveness. And the first thing that I realized was that pairing seems to create waste, right? So this idea of, oh, you have two people working on the same thing, isn't that wasteful? But it can actually help you avoid a lot of waste as well. And I don't know who here has heard about the 7 wastes of software development. So there's an idea in lean manufacturing of the 7 wastes in lean manufacturing. And Tom and Mary Poppendieck actually took these and found an analogy on the software side. So, and the 7 wastes of software development, according to them, are partially done work, extra features, relearning, handoffs, delays, task switching, and defects. And for a lot of these things, I think pairing helps reduce these types of waste. So I want to highlight just a few of them. One of the more obvious ones, I think, is defects. So one of the core ideas of pairing is that you have two people who do just-in-time code review and who put their knowledge together. So you want to actually increase the quality. That's one of the ultimate goals. You want to avoid bugs and errors. Another one is relearning. So in software, according to the Poppendieks, relearning is, for example, created by poor planning. So relearning means kind of somebody on the team has already figured something out, but then you have to figure it out again because they're not there or they didn't document it or things like that. So in terms of poor planning, when you're working in a pair, you actually have to plan how you implement your story or your task very explicitly. It can't just all happen in your head. You actually have to put a little bit more effort into it because you have to communicate. Also, poor communication can create relearning waste. And again, when you work with two people, you have to communicate and you have to make things explicit. So it kind of pushes you to get better at those things. And poor readability of code can also, or poor documentation can also lead to relearning waste. And two people bring together their perspectives on what's understandable code and naming, and that might actually also make the code more readable. And finally, another one is waste that gets created from handoffs. So the Poppendieks make an assumption in their book. They say, let's assume that with each handoff, 50% of tacit knowledge gets left behind. So tacit knowledge is kind of the quiet knowledge, so that's not explicit. And they actually think that's probably a conservative estimate, that it's just 50% that gets left behind with every handoff. So if you lose 50% in every handoff, after one, you only have 50% of the knowledge left. After two, it's only 25% of the original knowledge, and so on and so on. And pairing can help you reduce those handoffs and also build up tacit knowledge in two people at the same time, so you have some backup. And by the way, if you're, there's another practice that comes with pair programming of pair rotation that you do to also spread the knowledge in the team. And if you do that too zealously, then you might actually also counteract some of the positive effects of pair programming, because you might actually create too many handoffs and too much waste in that sense. And an example of handoff where you potentially lose tacit knowledge are asynchronous code reviews after the fact. So where you have two people sitting in different places, and then the coder says, no need to double check this list. If some problem is there, the reviewer will catch it. And then maybe the reviewer thinks, no need to look at this too closely. I'm sure the author knows what he's doing. So this is sometimes what happens, I think, if we do code review this way. Another thing I realized is the relationship between pairing and flow of the team that I hadn't seen before I had been doing it for a longer time. And on the one hand, it's flow in the sense of focus for the individuals doing the coding. So the planning together at the beginning of a pairing session I already mentioned, figuring out the steps to take together, but also I appreciate a lot, for example, when I'm the driver, so the typer, and I know the other person's kind of having the bigger picture and they're taking some notes, then I know that I can just focus on what I'm doing right now and finish that. But when I'm working by myself, I sometimes feel like my brain is all over the place, already seeing those other things that I have to do later, and then I get distracted from what I'm doing currently, so it really helps me stay focused. And also, when I pair, I cannot be distracted by emails and Slack messages and all that. I know that when I'm by myself, I often, especially when I'm working on something and I'm not really moving forward, I'm kind of stuck, I tend to just procrastinate by looking at my emails, looking at Slack messages, and I cannot do that when there's another person sitting next to me, so we actually have to work on what we're doing. But also, sorry about the clicker, I think the battery's down. So often when I do that, when I work on a problem and then I look at my emails or something, it's kind of like multitasking, right? I'm doing it and I might not even notice it. And many of you will probably have heard about the studies telling us that multitasking is bad for our brains, but still we sometimes take it as a badge of honor. Oh, I can multitask, I can do these things at the same time, so I'm more productive. I think there's one study even that says that our IQ drops more points when we multitask than it does when we smoke marijuana. And still we keep doing it. So this graph kind of shows this idea of when we're doing all these things at the same time, all of them together actually take longer than if we're doing them sequentially. So I see pairing as being kind of each other's fitness buddies to keep on track and do things sequentially instead of at the same time. But also, flow in the sense of the team can be improved when you pair. So it can help reduce the team's work in progress, which has been shown to also increase the team's productivity. So if you imagine you have 8 developers on a team and they all work on 8 different things, then you have 8 work streams, 8 balls that the team has to keep in the air, that the product owner has to coordinate, that somebody from another team might barge in and say, did you change this, did you change that? You have to fix bugs for all of them, and so on. And if you have 4 pairs instead of 8 developers working on things, you actually have less things, and therefore you don't work on as many things in parallel as a team. And the last benefit I want to talk about is that pairing also enables kind of true continuous integration. And what I mean by that is really continuous integration, where every developer tries to integrate into the master at least once a day. So pairing is kind of code review on the go. You don't have this asynchronous back and forth and have to wait for your review to then maybe merge into master. And also through pairing, you get a lot more collective code ownership. So more people see more parts of the code, so everybody feels a bit more safe about what's actually going on. And both of those things actually create more safety for everybody to integrate into master at least once daily, or also what's sometimes called trunk-based development. And trunk-based development has actually shown to have a positive correlation with the team's delivery performance or effectiveness in the State of DevOps report, or the Accelerate book by Nicole Forsgren and others, for those of you who have maybe heard of those resources. So that was my pitch of the benefits. So it's 1 + 1 is larger than 2. It helps you avoid waste. It improves the flow, and it helps you with continuous integration. So maybe I've convinced some of you that pairing leads to more effective teams now, but unfortunately, it doesn't always. So it can lead to more effective teams, but because it's not as easy as just passing the keyboard back and forth, it can actually also be harmful instead of helpful. And I want to talk about a few of the most common challenges of pairing next. This is my colleague Michael having a bad day. So one of the first challenges is energy. It's actually exhausting. And this is also a real picture from the wild. These are 2 of my coworkers in the middle of a pairing session taking a break. So they decided together, we're going to take a break, rest our eyes. Ivo is looking out the window there, looking at the clouds, resting his eyes. Yeah. And one of the things that we often see when a team is really committed to making pair programming work is they start pairing 8 hours a day. And that's actually not sustainable. So when working by yourself, you also do things other than coding, right? You check your emails, you maybe have one-on-ones with other people on the team, you go to meetings, you have to do some research, you have to learn something new you have to do in this task that you're doing. So try to incorporate that into the pairing routine. So plan your day together, all the different things you need to do, taking breaks for other communications or meetings, and don't assume that it will all be 100% pair coding, but think of it more as pair development. So you're working on a story or a task together. Another thing is taking breaks, which seems obvious, but is still often forgotten, right? Especially ideally, if you get into a flow as a pair. Maybe also some people are sometimes reluctant to bring up, can we take a break, if they feel like their pair is really energized and you kind of feel bad that you are low energy and you don't want to bring it up. Switching roles and modes of what you're doing also really helps with changing things up and bringing some variety. Like I said before, this idea of pair development and instead of just writing code together all the time. So energy, I think, is improvable if you pace yourselves and acknowledge that you don't always have to be joined at the hip coding when you pair on something together. The harder nut to crack, I think, is that pairing is a form of quite intense collaboration, and we're often not used to that. So we actually have to talk to each other and get to know each other and our habits to a certain point so that we can figure out how to work with each other. So feedback is really crucial here, and pairing is actually a great opportunity to practice giving and receiving feedback. It's quite a daunting thing for a lot of people, but pairing gives this opportunity to maybe at the end of the day do like a quick little chunk and not make it such a big thing. And also there's a clear goal to the feedback. You want to improve the collaboration with this other person. So that is kind of the topic. It's not about like you did this thing and that thing you do is bad, but it's just about like how can we improve how we work together. So you can really practice that nicely with it, I think. Another thing is this whole idea of getting to know each other and your habits and maybe your pet peeves. So maybe exchange something like readmes, either literally about yourself, kind of saying like, Birgitta always needs to go to lunch at 12, because at 12:45 I get hangry, right? So maybe my pair likes to go for lunch at 1, and that might not work out so well, right? So we have to figure out how to deal with that, just as a simple example. So when you first pair, kind of have this conversation a little bit about how you work, and then plan and try out a few things. So this awareness of our differences and how they relate to pairing is really important. Sometimes people think it's a really good idea if you have more junior people on the team, if you pair them with the more experienced people, so that they can learn from those more experienced people. But pairing is not necessarily just a learning exercise. It's about a lot more than that. And sometimes it's actually not a good idea to have a really experienced person pair with a very junior person, because the very experienced person, it might be very hard for them at this point to explain certain things, whereas the junior person might need very clear rules in the beginning to then later learn how to break them. And if that doesn't work, or if you don't get along with somebody, if your styles just don't match up, I think it's also okay sometimes to say, we just don't work well together. So you don't have to force each other, you don't have to force yourself to pair with this person if it makes you miserable all the time. And you're doing all these things and it still doesn't get better. Because finally, pairing is hard because it's personal. And so you're sharing very close physical space, at least if you're not remote pairing, but on the same desk. You're sharing your computers, notifications might pop up, you might have to expose which IDE shortcuts you know and which ones you don't know. And how big of a deal this actually is dawned on me only when I first read a blog post by a guy called Tom Howlett, titled "The Shame of Pair Programming." And he says in that blog post that to pair requires vulnerability. It means sharing all that you know and all that you don't know. This is hard for us. He continues that programmers are supposed to be smart, really smart, and most people look at what we do and they say, I could never do that. And it makes us feel a bit special sometimes, his words, and gives us a sense of pride. And pride actually creates invulnerability, so it doesn't help with the pairing there. And thinking back on what Jean Bartik found so great about pairing, she said, I like that you can criticize each other and find each other's errors. That's, of course, only constructive or helpful if you actually have this situation where both people open themselves up and are a bit vulnerable and also accept that criticism and try to improve the collaboration. So it only works in an environment where everybody really believes in the prime directives, that we always do the best that we can with what we know at the time and the skills available. So those were some of the challenges. And I told you in the beginning that at this point I want to take a last attempt to convince you. So we just talked a lot about the negative things, and maybe now after you got a high, after the benefits, now you're like, maybe it's a little bit too much work. So one last attempt. Because if you want to get better at pairing, there's a whole list of skills that you need to work on and improve. Your concentration, which is actually a skill that we can work on, task organization, time management, communication, giving and receiving feedback, empathy. So it's a whole laundry list of things and might seem like a lot of effort. But actually, these are all things that you need anyway on a highly effective team. So if everybody on the team works on these skills, that actually can make you better as a team. And pairing can be a great catalyst to help you work on all these things. even if that might feel uncomfortable at first, like always when we're learning things. I saw a great talk at the Lead Developer Conference in London last year by Pia Nilsson from Spotify, and she talked about how when they introduced certain practices in her team to improve the flow of the work, the friction actually increased. So there seemed to be a little bit more stress, a little less fun. So it was things like a work in progress limit, test-driven development, pair programming, mob programming. And another factor I think that you could add here is diversity. Diversity of perspectives, experience, skills, or gender. And diversity is generally talked about as something that we know can improve a team's performance, but it often increases friction first. And it also actually increases the challenges of pair programming I talked about, potentially. Things like being vulnerable, for example, are especially hard for people from underrepresented groups in tech because you already feel a bit like you're standing out and you have to prove a little bit more what you can do. So it's harder for us to be more vulnerable. And I'm saying us because as a woman, I count myself as a member of that group. I recently read an article from the Harvard Business Review that has this very clickbaity title. It says, diverse teams feel less comfortable, and that's why they perform better. And that seems a bit weird, right? So that's why clickbait. And the authors are also saying that this idea goes against many people's intuitions. And but they actually say that homogeneous teams feel easier, but easy is bad for performance. And to explain that, they talk about this bias called the Fluency Heuristic. And that bias says that we prefer information that is more easily processed, and we think that information is more true or more beautiful. So if something feels easy, we think, so it must be true because it's easy. And I think this bias in a lot of situations in software development actually serves us very well because we always want to strive for simplicity for good reasons. But maybe in the case of pairing, when we feel it's hard or uncomfortable in the beginning, maybe it's not serving us so well if we give up immediately. And it also doesn't have to stay hard. And Pia went on in the talk about what they did to reduce that friction again. So she talked about feedback, nonviolent communication, humility, positive retros, sense of purpose. So if you're interested in all these things, then I really recommend you watch her talk, and she has some good resources in there. And before I conclude, because I talked about it being hard a lot at this point, I also want to mention at least one time that it's actually really fun. And that's actually one of the things that some of my colleagues would mention first when you ask them about pair programming. And I also feel like it made me better as an individual developer, because now I feel like I always have all these people kind of on my shoulder telling me things like, there's this one person who's always in my head who always says, do we really need to do this? Or there's somebody who gets me out of a rabbit hole, or all these things that I think having that routine of pairing really also made me better for the times that I worked by myself. So in conclusion, pair programming, extreme programming, agile as a whole, they're all about embracing change. So we have, as an industry, acknowledged that change is inevitable in software development. It's also a very uncertain environment, so we just want to be prepared for it. And another thing I think that we should embrace and prepare for is friction, because it's also inevitable in a way on the way to becoming a highly effective team. And by embracing friction, I do not mean let's just have lots of conflicts out there so that we get better, but just accept that ultimately, if we're in a very productive environment, there are going to be conflicts and friction. So we all need to practice feedback, communication, things like that, to have the tools to deal with that. And as I laid out, pair programming, I think it's a great catalyst to practice all those things. So I believe pair programming is often avoided because it can create friction. But if you consciously see it as a skill and work on getting better at it, you prepare yourself and the team for that inevitable friction that is coming up if you want to become a diverse and high-performing team and also collaborate better as a whole. And that was what I had to say today, but actually my friend Nina, who's here in the second row, and me, we just recently wrote quite an extensive article about pair programming, where we also added things like actual techniques, so a little bit more into more practical things. And we are almost done with that and just about to publish that. So if you're interested in that, then follow me and Nina on Twitter, and we'll tweet about it when it's public. Yeah. Thank you.